Plato's story doesn't begin with the image of a calm philosopher sitting behind scrolls. It begins in a city in turmoil, a world where Athens struggled to balance war, pride, culture, and political chaos. Understanding how Socrates shaped him requires understanding the environment Plato grew up in and the psychological shadow that Socrates cast across Athenian life. The connection between these two thinkers wasn't merely academic. It was emotional, transformative, and ultimately tragic. Plato didn't just learn from Socrates, he inherited the mission Socrates died for. Plato was born into an aristocratic family, a world of privilege and access. His family expected him to enter politics, the most prestigious path for someone of his position. Athens was a city where politics wasn't just a profession, it was the heartbeat of identity. Rising to leadership meant honor for the family, stability for the city, and influence over culture. Young Plato was intelligent, charismatic, and trained in the arts expected of future leaders: music, poetry, mathematics, athletic training, and rhetoric. His early years were preparing him to become someone who shaped laws, not someone who questioned them. But then he encountered Socrates, and that was the moment everything changed. Socrates wasn't the kind of teacher parents approved of. He wasn't wealthy, he didn't dress well, he didn't write books, he didn't run a school. He wandered around the markets, speaking to anyone who would listen, challenging people who claimed to be wise, poking holes in arguments, exposing ignorance, and pushing people to examine their own lives. Some loved him, many hated him. But to Plato, Socrates was electrifying, a man who lived according to his principles, who refused to bow to public opinion, and who believed truth was more important than power. Imagine young Plato standing in the crowd while Socrates questioned important politicians, exposing the cracks in their thinking. For someone raised in a political household, seeing a single man with nothing but questions bring powerful individuals to silence must have been mind-shifting. Plato wasn't just learning about philosophy, he was learning about courage. He watched a man who treated truth not as a theory but as a way of life. For Plato, Socrates became a kind of spiritual father, reshaping the path that had been laid out for him. Socrates didn't teach in the traditional sense. He asked questions instead of delivering lectures. His method, now called the Socratic method, forced people to confront their assumptions. He made wisdom into something active, not passive. Plato absorbed this deeply. In the dialogues he would later write, you can feel his admiration in how he portrays Socrates: calm, witty, fearless, unshakable. Plato wasn't merely recording conversations, he was preserving a man he considered the perfect model of a philosopher. But the emotional connection between Plato and Socrates went even deeper. Athens, at that time, was recovering from the Peloponnesian War, dealing with economic struggles, political instability, and deep mistrust of intellectuals. Socrates, with his constant questioning, became a symbol of discomfort for the powerful. As Plato saw Athenian politics make irrational decisions, including executing generals and mishandling crises, he began to question whether the political life he had been raised for was even worthy of participation. Socrates fed this doubt. He encouraged young minds to seek virtue over popularity, wisdom over influence. For Plato, who admired moral strength, Socrates became proof that one could resist corruption and remain true to one's principles. This shaped his understanding of what leadership should be: not ambitions driven by greed or glory, but leadership rooted in knowledge, ethics, and the courage to speak truth. The turning point, the event that forever changed Plato, was the trial and execution of Socrates. For Plato, This wasn't simply the death of a mentor. It was the collapse of everything he believed Athens stood for. Socrates was accused of corrupting the youth and disrespecting the gods, but these charges were shallow excuses. The real threat Socrates posed was intellectual. He embarrassed politicians, exposed contradictions in their reasoning, and forced society to confront its own moral failings. His death wasn't just a punishment, it was a silencing. Plato watched the trial unfold with disbelief. Here was a man who had never harmed anyone, who had only urged people to think carefully about how to live, and yet the democratic system, the very institution meant to uphold justice, condemned him. This was traumatic for Plato. He realized that democracy without wisdom could be dangerous. The citizens, swayed by emotions and political games, chose to kill a harmless philosopher instead of listening to him. This event completely derailed Plato's political ambitions. Before Socrates' death, Plato had still considered entering politics. After the execution, he lost faith in the stability and intelligence of the Athenian political system. How could he join a system capable of murdering the wisest man he had ever known? Plato later wrote that he felt the political life was too filled with corruption for any honest man to survive. This wasn't a philosophical conclusion, it was personal, born from grief and disillusionment. Socrates' final moments embedded themselves into Plato's soul. The calmness with which Socrates drank the hemlock, the serenity in his reasoning even as he faced death, and the courage to stand by truth even when it cost him everything, these became the core values Plato carried into his philosophy. What he witnessed wasn't just a tragedy, it was a revelation. Socrates was living proof that philosophy wasn't about ideas alone. It was a way of life that demanded integrity. After the execution, Plato could have faded into bitterness or anger. Instead, he transformed his grief into purpose. He began writing dialogues, preserving Socrates' voice for future generations. These writings weren't just tributes, they were acts of resistance. Plato refused to let the Athenian government silence his teacher. Through dialogue after dialogue, Plato made sure Socrates lived on, questioning, challenging, inspiring. Plato's entire philosophical system begins with this emotional wound. His theory of justice, education, morality, politics, and even metaphysics can be traced back to Socrates' influence. Plato wanted to build a world where the injustice that killed Socrates could never happen again. This is why he emphasized the importance of knowledge for rulers. This is why he distrusted democracy. This is why he believed truth must be pursued above all else. Plato's Academy, the school he later founded, was in many ways an extended continuation of Socrates' mission. It was a place where questioning was encouraged, where students were trained to think critically, and where philosophy was treated as a living discipline. The Academy wasn't about memorization, it was about investigation. Plato built the institution Socrates never had but always embodied. The spark Socrates lit in him grew into a flame that illuminated centuries of philosophical development. Even Plato's understanding of the human soul carries Socratic fingerprints. Socrates insisted that care of the soul was the most important task for any human being. Plato expanded this into a detailed theory of the soul's structure, its immortality, and its path toward understanding truth. But the heart of the idea, the belief that the soul must be cultivated through examination, came from Socrates. Their connection was not just teacher-student, it was ideological inheritance. Without Socrates, Plato would have become a statesman. With Socrates, he became a philosopher who shaped Western civilization. The emotional resonance of their relationship is evident in the way Plato writes. In his earlier works, Socrates is lively, humorous, sharp, and deeply human, almost like Plato is remembering him with affection. In later works, Socrates becomes more formal, almost symbolic, a representation of pure philosophical reasoning. This shift reflects Plato's own transformation from a grieving student to a mature philosopher developing his own ideas. But even when Plato's philosophy evolves beyond Socratic questioning into the more structured world of forms, the Socratic foundation is always there. The death of Socrates also planted a sense of urgency in Plato. He understood that ideas were fragile, they could be erased if not preserved. This is why he wrote dialogues instead of treatises. The conversational format kept Socrates alive. It made philosophy interactive, alive in the reader's mind. Plato wasn't just explaining ideas. He was recreating Socrates' method for future generations. The depth of influence becomes even clearer when we consider Plato's views on ethics. Socrates believed virtue was knowledge that people do wrong only when they are ignorant of what is truly good. Plato took this and built an entire moral system around the idea that the soul must be trained to recognize higher truths. For Plato, the good life wasn't about wealth or power. It was about aligning the soul with moral truth. This was Socrates' message, reframed and deepened. Even in moments where Plato seems to disagree with Socrates, such as his theory of forms, the disagreement is born from the foundation Socrates laid. Plato is trying to solve problems Socrates raised. Their relationship wasn't one of imitation. It was one of intellectual continuation. Plato's grief turned into an intellectual mission that spanned decades. He traveled, studied with other philosophers, learned from mathematicians and spiritual thinkers, and eventually returned to Athens to create a school that would carry his ideas and Socrates' spirit through time. Without Socrates, there would be no Plato. Without Plato, there would be no written legacy of Socrates. Their bond forms one of the most important relationships in the entire history of philosophy. Plato's early life wasn't merely influenced by Socrates. It was shaped, molded, sculpted, and spiritually activated by him. Socrates was the catalyst that turned a politically trained youth into one of the greatest minds the world has ever known. The tragedy of Socrates' execution did not end with grief. It triggered a profound transformation in Plato. This wasn't an ordinary student losing a teacher. It was a moment of philosophical rebirth. Plato began to see the world through entirely new eyes. Everything he thought he understood about politics, justice, and morality had collapsed in front of him. Athens, the city famed for its democracy and intellectual life, had willingly killed its wisest citizen. This single event defined Plato's intellectual mission: to figure out why such a failure could happen and how a society could be structured so it would never happen again. The political impact: why Plato abandoned public life before Socrates' death. Plato genuinely considered a political career. He had the pedigree, connections, and training. His family was a major part of the Athenian aristocracy. His relatives, Critias and Charmides, were involved in the governing bodies of Athens. Politics wasn't just an option, it was expected. But the execution shattered any trust Plato had in democratic decision-making. He discovered that even a system built on votes and public participation could be manipulated by rhetoric, ignorance, fear, and resentment. The emotional power of crowds could override reason. For Plato, the death of Socrates revealed the fragility of justice. This realization shaped the rest of Plato's work. His distrust of democracy, a central theme in the Republic, the Statesman, and the Laws, wasn't the opinion of a detached thinker. It was a wound. Plato believed that unless rulers were guided by knowledge, philosophy, and moral discipline, political systems would collapse into corruption or tyranny. Plato's later vision of the philosopher, king, arose directly from watching the Athenian citizens choose resentment over truth. The emotional impact, a teacher's death as a moral lesson. Plato wasn't a cold intellectual. His writings show a deeply emotional soul. For him, Socrates embodied a kind of moral heroism, the courage to face death rather than betray principle. The calmness with which Socrates accepted the hemlock became the ultimate lesson for Plato. It demonstrated that a just person would not compromise truth for safety or popularity. It proved that the soul mattered more than the body. It confirmed that philosophy wasn't merely an argument. It was a way of life worth dying for. This emotional core is why Plato became obsessed with the nature of the soul. Socrates believed the soul must be purified through self-examination. Plato expanded this into a universe where the soul journeys toward truth, falls into ignorance, and climbs back through reason and education. In works like Phaedo, Gorgias, and Republic, the soul becomes the central battlefield between illusion and knowledge, a direct inheritance from Socrates' emphasis on inner virtue. The intellectual impact, Plato's search for objective truth, Socrates' method of questioning shattered certainty. But Plato wanted more than questions, he wanted answers. Socrates revealed the weaknesses in people's beliefs, but he rarely presented his own theories. Plato absorbed this method deeply, but also saw its limitations. After Socrates' death, Plato devoted himself to discovering the universal truths Socrates believed existed. This search led to one of Plato's most famous and influential theories, the theory of forms. While the sensory world was filled with change, imperfection, and contradictions, Plato believed that beyond it lay a realm of perfect, eternal ideas, the forms. For example, every circle drawn in the sand is imperfect, but the idea of a perfect circle exists in the mind. Every act of justice is flawed, but the form of justice itself is pure. Plato created this metaphysical system to answer the deep questions Socrates raised. What is virtue? What is justice? What is truth? Plato wasn't inventing a new world view. He was continuing the path Socrates started, but taking it into deeper philosophical territory. Plato's travels after Socrates, a quest to understand political justice after the execution, Plato left Athens. Many ancient sources suggest he did so partly for safety. The political climate was unstable, and Socrates' associates weren't favored, but the deeper reason was intellectual. He needed distance, he needed perspective, he needed to reconstruct his world view. His travels likely took him to Egypt, where he encountered ancient mathematical and religious traditions; Cyrene, where he studied with mathematicians; Italy, where Pythagorean thinkers influenced his ideas about harmony, the soul, and the structure of the universe; Sicily, where he observed political systems and even attempted to educate a young ruler, Dionysius Roman II, in the hope of creating a philosopher, king. This mission in Sicily, although ultimately a failure, is a powerful example of how strongly Socrates shaped Plato. Plato genuinely believed that a ruler educated in philosophy could transform society. His attempt to bring philosophy into government wasn't naive. It was the fulfillment of the moral awakening Socrates had sparked in him. Socrates had died because ignorant rulers held power. Plato wanted to change that. The literary impact, why Plato chose the dialogue form, the most direct evidence of Socrates' impact, appears in Plato's writing. Unlike most philosophers, Plato didn't write treatises. he wrote dialogues. Socrates appears as the central voice in nearly all of them. This is not a stylistic choice. It's an emotional and philosophical resurrection. Through dialogue, Plato achieved multiple goals. He kept Socrates alive. Plato knew that writing was the only weapon he had to protect Socrates from being forgotten or reduced to a criminal in the public memory. He preserved the Socratic method. Each dialogue is structured as a conversation, a process of questioning, listening, refining, challenging, and gradually uncovering truth. He turned philosophy into something interactive. The reader becomes part of the conversation. The form pulls you in, makes you question, makes you think. This is exactly what Socrates did. He allowed complex ideas to unfold naturally. Instead of lecturing, Plato designed scenarios, characters, and debates that reveal deeper truths through argument and reflection. He honored his teacher structurally as well as conceptually. In preserving Socrates' voice, Plato created the foundation for Western philosophical writing. If Socrates had lived longer or written his own works, Plato's entire literary approach might have been different. Instead, grief shaped creativity, memory shaped form, the moral impact. Plato's lifelong war against ignorance. Socrates believed that ignorance, not malice, was the root of wrongdoing. When people know what is good, they act accordingly. When they don't, they fall into injustice. Plato took this idea and built a lifelong mission around it. He believed that education wasn't simply about transferring knowledge. It was about shaping the soul. True education helps people recognize the difference between appearance and reality, between emotion and reason, between opinion and truth. Plato was so shaped by Socratic ethics that he created one of the earliest educational systems focused on moral development. This is why, in the Republic, education is structured in stages. Music and gymnastics to shape character, mathematics to discipline the mind, dialectic to train reason, philosophy to guide the soul. Socrates gave Plato the foundation: examine life, pursue virtue, question assumptions. Plato added structure, discipline, and a vision of education that could transform societies. The spiritual impact, the nature of the soul and its journey. Socrates regularly spoke about the importance of caring for the soul. Plato expanded this into a grand metaphysical framework. After Socrates' death, Plato became increasingly interested in the immortality of the soul, the afterlife, and the soul's relationship to truth. In Phaedo, Plato describes Socrates' final hours and uses that setting to explore the soul's immortality. The dialogue is deeply emotional, a philosophical reflection tied directly to the most traumatic moment of Plato's life. Plato's vision of the soul reflects Socratic moral seriousness, a desire to justify Socrates' calm acceptance of death, a belief that philosophy prepares the soul for liberation. Plato's spiritual philosophy is, in many ways, an attempt to make sense of the tragedy through a higher lens. The personal impact. Plato's identity was rewritten before Socrates. Plato was an aristocratic youth preparing for politics. After Socrates, Plato became a philosopher, a writer, an educator, a critic of democracy, a moral reformer, a seeker of universal truth, a founder of the Logos, running school in history. Socrates didn't just teach Plato how to think. He taught him who he wanted to be. That transformation is the most significant evidence of Socrates' influence. How Socrates lives on in Plato's mature works, in Plato's early dialogues. Socrates is lively and human. In his middle works, Socrates becomes a medium for exploring the forms. In his later works, Socrates is sometimes replaced by other characters, but the Socratic spirit remains. Even when Plato develops ideas that go beyond Socrates, the foundational impulse remains the same: a commitment to reason, self-examination, and moral integrity. The influence is so profound that many scholars argue it is impossible to know where Socrates ends and Plato begins. Their ideas are intertwined, their philosophies overlapping, and their missions connected by a shared pursuit of truth. The legacy impact. Plato became Socrates' immortal voice. If Plato had not existed, the world would know almost nothing about Socrates. The entire legacy of one of the greatest philosophers rests in Plato's writings. This fact alone shows the depth of their connection. Socrates shaped Plato. Plato preserved Socrates. It was the perfect philosophical cycle. Plato's dialogues became the foundation of Western thought. Every generation encounters Socrates' questions, not because of Athens, but because Plato refused to let the voice of his teacher fade. In this way, Socrates' death was not the end. It was the spark that ignited 400 years of philosophical inquiry. Conclusion of the full 5,000-word explanation. Plato's early life, world, an entire philosophical mission were shaped by Socrates in a way that was emotional, intellectual, moral, political, and spiritual. The execution of Socrates turned a privileged aristocrat into a determined philosopher devoted to truth, justice, and the transformation of society. Socrates was not just Plato's teacher, he was the defining force of his life. Every idea Plato developed, every dialogue he wrote, every theory he constructed, every political vision he imagined, and every student he taught was, in one way or another, a continuation of Socrates' impact. Without Socrates, Plato would not have become Plato. To understand how Plato changed the entire direction of human thought, we need to step inside the world of ancient Greece, a world filled with constant change, political chaos, and a never-ending search for stability. Plato wasn't just studying philosophy. He was living through instability that forced him to question everything around him. The death of Socrates pushed him into a deeper search for certainty, and that search led him toward one of the most influential ideas in the history of philosophy, the theory of forms. This theory didn't simply add to philosophy. It reshaped the entire foundation of Western thought. It transformed how people understood truth, knowledge, morality, mathematics, beauty, justice, and even the idea of what real means. Before Plato, thinkers struggled to explain why the world was always shifting, imperfect, unreliable, and full of contradictions. After Plato, philosophers suddenly had a new structure, a blueprint, that explained both the physical world and the world of the mind. To understand why Plato invented the theory of forms, picture him living in a world where nothing stays still. Buildings crumble, people age, empires rise and fall, ideas shift, opinions change, even emotions move like waves. A world of change makes it almost impossible to find stable truth. Plato looked at this chaos and felt the need for something permanent, something that never changed, never decayed, never contradicted itself, something absolutely pure. He believed that if humans were going to understand anything truly, not just temporarily, they needed to look beyond the physical world. This is the root of the theory of forms, a belief that behind the world we see is a deeper, invisible world that contains the perfect versions of everything. When Plato looked at the physical world, he saw only shadows. Shadows of chairs, shadows of beauty, shadows of justice, shadows of triangles, shadows of goodness. The physical world wasn't fake, but it wasn't fully real either. It was an imitation, a reflection of something higher. For example, think of a simple triangle. Every triangle you draw on paper has imperfections. The lines aren't perfectly straight. The angles aren't exactly accurate, but in your mind you can imagine a perfect triangle, one with absolutely precise angles, flawless lines. That mental perfect triangle is what Plato would call a form. It is unchanging, eternal, and perfect. Every real triangle in the world is just a copy of that ideal form. For Plato, this wasn't just true about math, it was true about beauty, justice, love, courage, strength, harmony, and even goodness itself. He believed that the physical world is made up of copies, but the world of forms contains the originals. This idea was revolutionary because it gave philosophers a new way to think about truth. Truth wasn't something you find through the senses, because senses deceive. Eyes see illusions, ears hear distortions, touch is unreliable. The senses give you appearances, not reality. So Plato argued that true knowledge must come from the mind, not the senses. The world of forms can only be accessed through reason, thought, reflection, and philosophical training. This idea shook Greek philosophy to its core. Before Plato, thinkers like the Sophists argued that truth was relative. What's true for you may not be true for someone else. Plato responded by saying, "No truth is absolute. You just have to look in the right place." That place was the world of forms. Plato's inspiration came from many sources: the mathematical precision of Pythagoreans, the moral clarity of Socrates, and his own frustration with the instability of the physical world. He began to see that physical reality was like shifting sand. You could build ideas on it, but they would collapse. Only something eternal could serve as a foundation for real knowledge. One of Plato's most famous explanations of the theory of forms is found in his dialogue, The Republic, where he introduces the allegory of the cave. In this story, prisoners live underground, chained in a way that they can only see shadows on the wall. Behind them, unseen objects are carried in front of a fire, creating those shadows. The prisoners believe the shadows are real because they've never seen anything else. This is Plato's metaphor for the human condition. Most people live their entire lives believing in shadows, believing in things that look real but aren't. The philosopher is the one who breaks free, climbs out of the cave, and sees the real world illuminated by the sun, the world of forms. When the philosopher returns to the cave to help others see the truth, the prisoners mock him because they cannot imagine a reality beyond shadows. Plato was describing his own journey. Socrates pulled him out of the cave of confusion. The trauma of Socrates' execution made Plato realize that society lived by shadows of justice, not real justice. So he built a theory to explain what true justice was: the form of justice, perfect and unchanging. All human laws and political systems are imperfect copies of this form. This explanation reshaped ethics forever. Suddenly, justice wasn't about what the majority believed. It was about aligning society with a higher truth. This idea became the core of Plato's political philosophy. He believed rulers should be philosophers because only philosophers understand the forms, and therefore only philosophers can build a just society. Another powerful implication of the theory of forms is in aesthetics, the study of beauty. When someone sees a beautiful painting or person, Plato believed they are experiencing a reminder of the form of beauty. Beauty in the physical world is temporary, but the form of beauty is eternal. Plato even connected this to love. In his Dialogue Symposium, he describes love as a force that guides the soul toward higher beauty, eventually reaching the form of beauty itself. This view revolutionized the concept of love as something spiritual and intellectual, not merely physical. But the most impactful consequence of the theory of forms is in epistemology, the study of knowledge. Plato argued that knowledge must be about what is unchanging. If something can change, then you can't be absolutely certain about it. Therefore, real knowledge must be about the forms, not about physical things. This distinction between opinion, doxa, and knowledge, episteme, became one of the most important contributions in the history of philosophy. The theory of forms also allowed Plato to explain how people learn. For him, learning isn't about discovering something new. It's about remembering something your soul already knows. He believed the soul existed before birth, lived among the forms, and then forgot them when it entered the body. Learning is simply recollection, a gradual remembering of truths once known. This idea gave a spiritual dimension to his metaphysics. Humans weren't just physical beings. They were souls temporarily attached to bodies, striving to recall eternal truths. Plato saw philosophy as the process of helping the soul remember. This is why Socrates insisted that knowledge comes from questioning. The more deeply you question yourself, the more you reconnect with the truth your soul once knew. One of the main challenges to Plato's theory of forms came from his own student, Aristotle, who argued that forms cannot exist separately from physical objects. But even Aristotle's criticism shows how groundbreaking Plato's idea was. For the rest of Western history, philosophers debated the forms, agreeing, disagreeing, modifying, or reacting, but never ignoring them. Because once Plato introduced the idea of two worlds, the physical and the ideal, philosophy could never think the same way again. In scientific thinking, the idea of a perfect form helped inspire the search for laws, patterns, and universal principles. Scientists now look for the ideal model behind natural phenomena, an approach rooted in Plato's belief that reality has an underlying structure. In mathematics, Plato's influence is enormous. Mathematicians think in terms of perfect shapes, perfect numbers, perfect relationships, all echoes of the world of forms. Mathematics became the pathway to higher understanding because, like the forms, mathematical truths never change. In ethics, Plato gave humanity a higher standard. Morality wasn't about tradition or convenience. It was about aligning oneself with eternal truths. In politics, Plato challenged the very idea of majority rule by insisting that only those who understand truth should lead. His philosopher, king concept remains one of the most discussed ideas in political philosophy. Even in theology, Plato's forms influenced early Christian thinkers. The idea of a perfect, eternal, immaterial reality beyond the physical world became intertwined with religious belief. Many Christian theologians saw the forms as reflections of divine ideas. The impact of Plato's theory of forms is everywhere in science, religion, ethics, mathematics, art, psychology, and politics. It shaped centuries of thought, guiding people toward a deeper understanding of truth beyond the visible world. But what makes the theory even more powerful is that it wasn't just an intellectual system. It was Plato's response to real life suffering and injustice. He saw how fragile the physical world was. He saw how quickly opinions could be manipulated. He saw how imperfect society could be. And instead of collapsing into despair, he built a philosophical structure that offered stability, clarity, and perfection. The theory of forms was Plato's attempt to save truth from chaos. That's why it was so revolutionary. It offered a stable foundation in a world that constantly changes. Plato knew that explaining the theory of forms wasn't just about talking philosophy in an abstract corner of the mind. It was about showing how this concept reshapes everything: human life, society, morality, knowledge, art, politics, and even the way we understand the soul. He wasn't creating a theory for scholars to admire. He was giving humanity a tool to re-examine what it means to live, think, and be human. Part B of this exploration takes the theory of forms and stretches it across the full landscape of human experience, revealing how deeply it influenced his world, you, and why it became one of the most enduring ideas in the history of thought. At its heart, the theory of forms says that every physical thing is an imperfect copy of a perfect, eternal, unchanging reality that exists beyond the physical world. But Plato didn't stop there. He insisted that this difference between appearance and reality was the key to understanding why people suffer confusion, why societies fall apart, and why individuals struggle to find meaning. Humans, he believed, chase shadows instead of truth. They attach themselves to temporary pleasures, temporary ambitions, temporary opinions, and temporary identities. They rarely look beyond the surface. Because of that, they misunderstand the true nature of justice, beauty, goodness, courage, and even love. For Plato, the forms weren't out there, somewhere far away. They were the foundation of everything that truly matters in life. Imagine someone who thinks beauty is only physical attractiveness. They see a beautiful face, a beautiful object, or a beautiful landscape and assume beauty exists only in what they can physically perceive. Plato argues that this is only the beginning, a faint shadow. True beauty is not found in any physical thing. It exists as a perfect form called beauty itself. Humans feel attraction to beautiful things because those things participate, imperfectly, in the form of beauty. But physical beauty fades, the form does not, and recognizing this difference, Plato says, opens the path to higher love, higher appreciation, and higher truth. The same thing applies to justice. People often think justice is about punishment or rules or the decisions of courts. But Plato believed justice had nothing to do with punishment first. It was a perfect, eternal principle about harmony, balance, and the proper functioning of the soul. A just society, then, could never exist unless leaders understood the form of justice, not just its shadow. A society run by people who only understand appearances will always produce chaos and inequality. Only philosophers, those who grasp the true form, could rightly guide a community toward harmony. This is why Plato argued so strongly for the philosopher, king. It wasn't about giving power to the smartest person. It was about giving leadership to someone who sees reality, not illusions. Knowledge, according to Plato, depends entirely on the forms. When people believe that knowledge comes only from the senses, they remain trapped in the world of change. Everything you see with your eyes can change. A tree grows, a body decays, a political system collapses, a friendship breaks. If you rely on the senses, then real knowledge is impossible. True knowledge must be about what does not change, and only the forms fit that description. This led Plato to draw one of the most important distinctions in philosophy, the difference between knowledge, episteme, and opinion, doxa. Most humans live in the world of opinion. They think they know things because they can see them or feel them. But Plato insists that only the philosopher, who understands the forms, truly knows anything at all. And this difference between knowledge and opinion is not just theoretical. It shapes Plato's entire educational philosophy. To educate someone is not to fill their mind. It is to turn their soul. It is to guide them away from illusions and toward the truth that exists beyond the senses. This is why Plato describes education using the metaphor of the eye. The soul's eye must be trained to look upward, away from the physical world and toward the realm of forms. Education is a painful process, because it requires leaving behind the world people think they know. It is a rebirth, a transformation, a reorientation of the soul, and once someone sees truth, they can never go back to ignorance without feeling a deep internal conflict. But the theory of forms doesn't stop at education. It reaches into the structure of the soul itself. For Plato, the human soul has three parts: the rational, the spirited, and the appetitive. The rational part seeks truth and wisdom. The spirited part seeks honor, courage, and social recognition. The appetitive part seeks pleasure, food, comfort, and material satisfaction. These parts constantly battle for control. Only the rational part, Plato says, can grasp the forms. Only the rational part can see the perfect, eternal truths that guide human behavior toward harmony. So a virtuous soul is one where the rational part rules, where wisdom dominates desires and emotions. Without the forms, the rational part has nothing to guide it. With the forms, it becomes the leader of a healthy, harmonious inner life. In this way, the theory of forms becomes the backbone of Plato's ethics. Courage isn't acting without fear. It is aligning oneself with the form of courage. Temperance isn't merely controlling one's appetite. It is living in harmony with the form of moderation. Wisdom isn't being intelligent. It is understanding the eternal truths. Virtue, then, becomes knowledge, not knowledge of facts, but knowledge of perfect realities. Someone who truly understands goodness cannot act badly, because their soul is anchored in something unchanging and eternal. Plato extends this idea into his view of art and poetry. This is where he becomes controversial. Because if physical objects are already imperfect copies of perfect forms, then art, which imitates physical objects, becomes an imitation of an imitation. It sits two steps away from the truth. For Plato, art is powerful precisely because it plays on emotions and illusions, not on reason and truth. A tragic play might teach people to value emotions over rational thought. A painting might make someone worship physical beauty instead of understanding true beauty. This is why Plato wanted to regulate art in his ideal society, not because he hated creativity, but because he believed art shaped the soul, and if it shaped the soul incorrectly, it led people away from truth. This leads directly into Plato's political philosophy. He believed society collapses when leaders are guided by shadows instead of forms. A leader who does not understand justice will create laws based on personal opinion. A society that does not understand goodness will confuse profit with morality. Plato watched Athens fill with politicians chasing popularity instead of wisdom, and he saw the consequences: corruption, division, war, and the execution of Socrates. For Plato, the theory of forms was not a luxury, it was a necessity. Without eternal truths guiding political life, society becomes driven by appetite and emotion, not wisdom. The form of the good stands above all other forms. Just like the sun in the visible world illuminates everything, the good illuminates all truth. Without the good, nothing can be understood. It is the source of all knowledge, morality, and existence. And this is why the philosopher, king, must know the form of the good, because a leader who cannot see the good cannot lead others toward it. A community guided by the good becomes harmonious, balanced, and just. A community guided by opinions collapses into conflict and disorder. Plato also believed that the soul's journey does not end with death. The eternal nature of the forms reflects the eternal nature of the soul. If the soul can grasp eternal truths, then it must share something in common with eternity itself. This leads Plato to argue that the soul existed before birth and will exist after death. In the realm before birth, the soul saw the forms clearly, but when it entered the body, it forgot them. Learning, therefore, is not discovering new information. It is remembering what the soul once knew. This process of recollection explains why humans feel instinctive attraction to beauty, truth, and goodness. Their souls recognize the echo of the forms. This understanding of the soul also shapes Plato's view of love. In the Symposium, he describes love as a ladder. At the bottom are physical attractions. But as someone grows wiser, they climb upward, from loving bodies to loving minds, to loving moral beauty, to loving knowledge, and finally to loving beauty itself, the pure form. Love becomes a path to spiritual elevation. The ultimate purpose of love is not possession, but transformation, the elevation of the soul toward eternal truth. In daily life, Plato's theory of forms encourages humans to ask deeper questions. What am I really chasing? Is my idea of success based on truth or illusion? Do I understand love as a physical desire, or as a path towards something higher? Is my sense of justice shaped by society, or rooted in something eternal? Are my ambitions shaped by shadows, or by knowledge of what truly matters? Plato pushes every individual to question the foundation of their beliefs, and to distinguish appearance from reality. He wants people to understand that most of what they see is temporary, but the values that truly guide a meaningful life, justice, goodness, beauty, truth, are eternal. The theory of forms also helps explain why ignorance is so widespread. People cling to opinions because opinions feel comfortable. Truth demands discipline, humility, and the courage to question everything. Truth requires a willingness to let go of comforting illusions. Plato believed ignorance was not simply a lack of knowledge. It was blindness, a refusal to see. And that refusal keeps individuals and societies trapped in cycles of conflict, dissatisfaction, and confusion. To embrace the forms is to seek clarity. It is to build a soul anchored in something eternal. It is to understand that while the physical world changes, the truths that give life meaning do not. Plato believed that only when people pursue these eternal truths can they achieve inner harmony, moral integrity, and lasting happiness. Without them, life becomes a chase for shadows endlessly moving, never fulfilled. The theory of forms, therefore, stands at the center of Plato's mission, to lift humanity out of ignorance and guide it toward wisdom. It gives structure to his view of the soul. It shapes his beliefs about education. It justifies his political theories. It defines his ethics. It frames his understanding of art. It connects the physical world to a higher spiritual reality. And through all of this, it becomes a philosophy not just of thought, but of life, a blueprint for anyone seeking truth in a world full of illusions. Even today, thousands of years later, people still return to Plato because they feel the same confusion he felt in Athens. They see societies guided by opinion instead of wisdom. They see people falling in love with appearances instead of truth. They see leaders chasing popularity instead of justice. And they sense, deep inside, that something important is missing. Plato's theory of forms still speaks to that missing piece, the longing for something unchanging, eternal, meaningful. It invites every person to step beyond the shadows and ask, what is real, what is true, what is worth living for? This is why Plato's philosophy endures. His theory of forms is not just a theory. It is a map of the human condition, a guide for anyone who wants to live a life directed by truth rather than illusion. Plato's Academy stands as one of the greatest intellectual creations of the ancient world, not just a school, but a new way of shaping the human mind. When Plato founded the Academy around 387 BC, he wasn't simply opening a place for lectures. He was offering humanity a fresh blueprint for thinking, learning, and seeking truth. What made the Academy so revolutionary is that it wasn't driven by memorization, authority, or rigid instruction. It was built on questions, dialogue, reasoning, and a deep commitment to understanding the eternal truths that Plato believed governed reality. The Academy was born out of Plato's personal experience, the trauma of watching Socrates executed by the Athenian democracy. This moment convinced Plato that societies fail when leaders lack wisdom. If Athens could kill its wisest man, then knowledge alone wasn't enough. There needed to be a system that trained minds to think clearly, reason ethically, and resist the illusions of public opinion. So Plato created a community where learning wasn't about passing exams, but about transforming the soul. Students entered not to gather information, but to reshape their entire way of seeing the world. Daily life in the Academy was nothing like modern schools. There were no grades, no official curriculum, no fixed lectures. Students engaged in long conversations, debates, mathematical demonstrations, philosophical arguments, and moral reflection. This was learning as a living activity, a practice, a constant effort to rise from confusion to clarity. And at the center of everything was dialectic, the art of questioning. This method, taught to Plato by Socrates, became the heartbeat of the Academy. Students were trained to question assumptions, challenge appearances, and push ideas until only the strongest survived. Plato believed that only through this kind of intellectual struggle could a person climb from the world of opinion to the world of knowledge. The Academy's environment was part of its magic. It was set in a peaceful grove dedicated to the hero Academus, far from the noise of the city. Surrounded by trees, walking paths, and open space, it created the perfect atmosphere for thinking. Plato understood that the mind works best when it is not trapped in noise and distractions. The Academy's setting encouraged reflection, calmness, and conversation. It wasn't a place where someone sat silently in a chair. It was a place of movement, both physical and intellectual. One of the most striking features of the Academy was its emphasis on mathematics. Plato famously wrote above the entrance, "Let no one ignorant of geometry enter here." He didn't say this because he wanted mathematicians. He said it because geometry trained the mind to think abstractly, to see beyond the senses. Mathematical truths don't change, they're eternal, like the forms. So by studying mathematics, students prepared their minds to grasp higher philosophical truths. Geometry, algebra, astronomy, and numerical harmony became tools for elevating the soul. The Academy also explored ethics, politics, psychology, and metaphysics. Students studied the nature of justice, the structure of the soul, the meaning of virtue, and the principles of good governance. Many of Plato's most famous dialogues were written as teaching tools. Capturing the types of conversations students were expected to participate in. The goal was not to turn students into scholars, but to form wise, rational, and virtuous human beings, the kind of people who could guide societies with clarity and integrity. One of the Academy's greatest contributions was its role in shaping Aristotle, who studied there for 20 years. Even though Aristotle later disagreed with Plato on many points, his intellectual foundation was entirely shaped by the Academy's environment. This single fact shows the power of what Plato built. It shaped not only its own time, but the future of philosophy, science, politics, and metaphysics. Through Aristotle, the Academy's influence spread into biology, logic, rhetoric, and ethics. Through later students, It shaped the mathematical tradition that eventually inspired modern physics. The Academy was more than a place of learning. It was a philosophical community. Students ate together, debated together, wrote together, and explored together. They shared a lifestyle shaped by reason, discipline, and moral purpose. Plato believed that knowledge without character was dangerous. So the Academy wasn't just training the mind, it was training the whole person. Students were expected to live virtuously, value truth, and cultivate self-control. The Academy wasn't preparing people to win arguments. It was preparing them to live wisely. This focus on moral character was rooted in Plato's belief that a just society must be built by just individuals. If the soul is disordered, society becomes disordered. If people do not understand the form of justice, they cannot create justice on earth. The Academy, therefore, became the training ground for philosopher leaders, not kings necessarily, but thinkers who could influence politics, ethics, and culture through wisdom. Plato wasn't trying to create rulers. He was trying to create minds capable of understanding what true leadership meant. Another important aspect of the Academy was its intellectual freedom. Plato didn't force students to agree with him. In fact, many of his dialogues end without a clear conclusion. This wasn't failure, it was intentional. Plato wanted students to continue thinking, questioning, and seeking. He knew that forcing answers on people produces weak minds. True wisdom comes from discovering truth through one's own reasoning and insight. So the Academy became a place where disagreement was encouraged, where ideas were tested like metal in fire, and where every conclusion had to be earned. The Academy lasted for nearly 900 years, an unbelievable lifespan for any school. It survived wars, political upheavals, and cultural shifts. It inspired countless thinkers, preserved philosophical traditions, and kept the spirit of Socrates alive through generations. Its endurance proves that Plato didn't simply create a school. He created an intellectual legacy strong enough to shape entire civilizations. What made Plato's Academy so special was not just its ideas, but its purpose. It existed to elevate human beings. It existed to push minds beyond the surface of life and into the deeper reality of truth. It existed to help people rise above ignorance, confusion, and illusion. The Academy was the physical expression of Plato's faith in reason and the human soul. He believed that the world could be better, and that better world began with better thinking. In the end, Plato's Academy stands as a reminder that education is not just about information. It is about transformation. It is about shaping individuals who can see clearly, think wisely, and act justly. Through the Academy, Plato offered humanity a path away from shadows and toward truth, a path that continues to inspire thinkers more than 2,000 years later. Plato's vision of education as the training of the mind toward truth. Plato believed that education wasn't just a system for teaching young people facts. It was the most powerful tool for shaping the soul, guiding society, and lifting humanity out of confusion. For him, the greatest danger in the world was ignorance masquerading as knowledge. People confuse opinions with truth, emotions with wisdom, and appearances with reality. This confusion leads to injustice, chaos, and misrule. Plato had seen this firsthand in Athens, where politicians stirred the masses with clever rhetoric, but no real understanding of justice or virtue. So he built an educational philosophy centered on one goal: transforming the mind so it can move from illusion to truth. To Plato, real learning did not begin with teaching, but with awakening. Every person is born into a world full of shadows, opinions, assumptions, social beliefs, traditions, and these shadows are so familiar that people mistake them for reality. The task of education is to turn the soul around so it can look beyond those shadows. This is why he used the metaphor of the cave. Humans live chained in darkness, watching the reflections of objects on a wall and assuming those reflections are the whole of existence. Education breaks those chains. It turns the soul toward the light so it can see the true objects, the eternal forms, not their fleeting images. But turning the soul is not easy. It requires discipline, struggle, curiosity, and the courage to question everything. For Plato, questioning was not disrespectful, it was sacred. It was the only way to overcome illusion. This is why Socratic dialogue sits at the center of his educational philosophy. He believed students should constantly challenge themselves, challenge other students, and challenge even their teachers. There was no room for blind obedience. Truth demands effort, and effort requires questioning. The moment a student stops questioning, the journey to wisdom stops. Plato also believed that education must train the mind to reason. Reason is the tool that allows humans to escape confusion and reach clarity. Emotions and desires are powerful, but they are unstable. They change from moment to moment. Reason is steady. It is capable of rising above personal biases and seeing what is universal and eternal. So Plato designed a system that strengthened the mind through stages, beginning with physical training and basic learning in childhood, and rising toward higher mathematics, geometry, dialectic, and finally philosophical contemplation. Mathematics played a central role because it trained the mind to think abstractly. Numbers don't change. Geometrical truths don't vary from person to person. Studying them pulls the mind away from sensory impressions and pushes it into the realm of pure thought. When a student learns that the sum of the angles in a triangle remains constant no matter its size, they learn that truth doesn't depend on feeling, opinion, or appearance. This prepares the mind to understand the forms, the perfect realities that lie beyond the physical world. As students advanced, they entered the stage Plato called dialectic. Dialectic wasn't about arguing to win. It was about using reasoning to uncover contradictions, refine definitions, and approach truth step by step. It was a mental workout designed to push the soul upward. Through dialectic, students tested every belief they held, stripping away confusion until they reached what could not be doubted. Plato believed this process was the highest form of intellectual training, because it taught students not what to think, but how to think. But Plato didn't believe education was only about intellect, it was also about morality. He believed the soul has three parts: reason, spirit, and appetite. Reason seeks truth, spirit seeks honor and courage, appetite seeks pleasure and comfort. Without education, appetite dominates, and people become ruled by their desires. But with proper training, reason becomes strong enough to guide the other parts of the soul. This produces a balanced, virtuous human being. And since the health of the soul shapes the health of society, education becomes the foundation of justice. A society cannot be just unless its citizens, especially its leaders, are trained to let reason guide their actions. Plato's educational philosophy also connects deeply with his belief that the purpose of life is to know the good. He believed the form of the good was the highest reality, the source of truth, beauty, and morality. Understanding the good is the ultimate goal of education. Once someone knows the good, they can live a meaningful life and help others do the same. But reaching this understanding requires years of reflection, inquiry, and self-discipline. It isn't gained quickly, and it isn't gained through memorizing facts. It is earned through the hard work of transforming the soul. Plato even believed that the wrong kind of education was dangerous. Rhetoric without truth could mislead. Poetry without moral discipline could inspire unhealthy emotions. Music without harmony could disorder the soul. He thought everything a person learns shapes the inner character. This is why he insisted that education must be guided by wisdom and ethical purpose. The wrong ideas can corrupt the soul just as the right ideas can elevate it. The goal of education, for Plato, was not to create workers or scholars, but to create wise, virtuous, and balanced individuals who could serve society. His philosopher, King Ideal, wasn't meant to be a fantasy of supreme rulers. It was a statement about the kind of people who should guide communities. Leaders should be those whose minds are trained to see truth, whose souls are trained to control desire, and whose hearts are committed to justice. Education was the preparation for this ideal form of citizenship. Even for ordinary people, Plato believed education should aim at producing inner harmony. When reason rules the soul, people live peacefully, act responsibly, and understand what truly matters. They avoid the chaos of being pulled by endless desires. They become thoughtful, ethical, and self-aware. In this sense, Plato saw education as a lifelong journey, the process of becoming who we were meant to be. In the end, Plato's philosophy of education remains revolutionary because it refuses to treat learning as a checklist. It sees education as a transformation of the entire human being. It insists that true learning must free the mind, discipline the soul, and guide the heart. For Plato, education is not preparation for life, it is life. It is the journey from darkness to light, from illusion to truth, and from confusion to wisdom. Plato's Republic explored his vision of a just society ruled by philosopher. King's Plato's idea of a just society is one of the most influential political concepts in Western thought, and at the center of that vision stands a figure both admired and criticized for centuries, the philosopher, King. To understand this idea, you have to understand the world Plato lived in. Athens was chaotic in his lifetime. War, corruption, political instability, and the execution of his teacher, Socrates, left him deeply skeptical of democracy and the people who held power. He watched unqualified leaders make reckless decisions. He saw public opinion shift like the wind, sometimes with tragic consequences. This background fueled his desire to imagine a system where wisdom, true, tested wisdom, would guide society. In the Republic, Plato sets up his argument by comparing the human soul to a city. He believed that just as a well-balanced soul allows a person to live virtuously, a well-structured city can allow a community to flourish. So he constructs a city in thought, a place where every part performs its proper role. He divides the city into three groups: the producers, the guardians, and the rulers. Each of these groups corresponds to a part of the human soul: desire, spirit, and reason. According to Plato, a harmonious city is one where each of these roles works together without overstepping its boundaries. But why should rulers be philosophers? In Plato's eyes, most people chase physical things: money, pleasures, comfort. There's nothing necessarily wrong with that, but it doesn't qualify someone to make decisions for an entire community. Kings, on the other hand, are trained their whole lives to understand truth, justice, the nature of the good, and the deeper patterns of the world. They study mathematics, logic, ethics, and the famous form of the good, the highest and most important philosophical concept in Plato's work. To Plato, only someone who truly understands the good can fairly rule a society, because they won't be blinded by personal desires emotions, or ambition. He uses a powerful metaphor known as the allegory of the cave to explain this. In this story, most people live like prisoners chained inside a cave, watching shadows on the wall and believing those shadows are reality. Only a philosopher escapes the cave, sees the real world outside, and understands the true nature of things. When that philosopher returns to the cave, he tries to help the others see the truth, but many resist, because shadows are all they've ever known. In the same way, Plato believes that most people are comfortable with illusions, while philosophers are the ones who seek truth. And because they see reality more clearly, they are the ones fit to rule. Of course, Plato doesn't imagine kings as perfect beings. Instead, he imagines them as people shaped by a lifetime of discipline, education, and moral training. They're not allowed to own private property, gather wealth, or hold personal power. This is intentional. He wants rulers who genuinely act for the good of the city, not for their own benefit. It's a radical idea, leaders who don't actually want to lead. In fact, Plato even says the best rulers are the ones who would prefer not to rule at all, because they aren't motivated by ambition. They accept leadership out of duty, not desire. Another major part of Plato's argument is his belief in specialization. Just as a skilled carpenter or musician becomes an expert through long practice, Plato argues that ruling a city is also a skill, one that requires years of intense training. He criticizes systems where leaders are chosen randomly by popularity or by wealth. To him, that's like letting someone fly a ship without any knowledge of navigation. A just society cannot rely on chance. It must trust its direction to people capable of steering wisely. And what does justice look like in Plato's ideal society? For him, justice means each part of the city doing what it is naturally suited for. Farmers farm, soldiers defend, rulers govern. No group oversteps or interferes with the others. When everyone focuses on their proper role, the city becomes stable and harmonious. Conflict arises, Plato argues, when people act outside their capabilities, for example, when the masses overthrow leaders they don't understand, or when hungry rulers chase wealth. The philosopher, king, solves this by acting as the mind of the city, ensuring the other parts operate smoothly. Now, this entire idea has sparked debate for centuries. Some admire it as a brilliantly structured vision of rational leadership. Others criticize it as elitist, unrealistic, or even authoritarian. Plato's belief that only a small group of people can truly understand truth doesn't sit well with modern democratic values. But even critics acknowledge that Plato raises powerful questions. What makes someone qualified to lead? Are wisdom and virtue more important than popularity? Can society function well when people pursue only their own interests? Plato isn't naive. He knows his ideal republic isn't likely to exist in reality. Even he admits that kings will probably never rule the world. But that's not the point. His goal is to create a model, a vision of what the most just society could look like, so people can compare their own governments to that ideal and work towards something better. In this sense, Plato sets up a standard for political excellence, a kind of philosophical lighthouse. Even if we never reach it, it guides us. The philosopher, king, also represents a deeper message, that leadership should be grounded in wisdom, virtue, and understanding, not wealth, fame, or brute force. Plato challenges us to think beyond the messy politics of our time and imagine what society could be if guided by people dedicated to truth. His vision continues to influence political thinkers, reformers, educators, and leaders who believe that knowledge is the path to justice. In the end, Plato's philosopher, king, is not just a ruler but a symbol of what humans can achieve when they rise above selfish desires and pursue the highest good. Whether or not his republic ever exists, the idea pushes us to question the world around us, to demand more from leaders, and to strive for wisdom in our own lives. And that, perhaps, is Plato's greatest political lesson, that justice begins with understanding, and understanding begins with the courage to think deeply and seek the truth. Plato's use of dialogue as his primary method of writing stands as one of the most distinctive choices in the entire history of philosophy. It wasn't accidental, and it wasn't merely an artistic preference. It was a deliberate, purposeful strategy designed to preserve the spirit of Socratic inquiry, to make philosophy feel alive, and to invite every reader into the process of questioning truth. In a world where most philosophers lectured, wrote treatises, or laid out strict arguments, Plato chose instead to build conversations, living exchanges that mirrored the rhythm, unpredictability, and intimacy of real thought. By doing this, he transformed philosophical writing into something more dynamic than simple explanation. He turned it into a shared exploration, one where the reader becomes an active participant rather than a silent observer. The dialogues reflect the personality of Socrates, whose entire method relied on conversation. Socrates never wrote anything, and his philosophy was never delivered as a fixed system. Instead, he questioned people in the marketplace, at banquets, in the gymnasium, even on the street. He probed assumptions, exposed contradictions, and guided people to deeper understanding by engaging them directly. Plato recognized that if he wrote philosophy like everyone else, strict arguments, numbered points, or didactic essays, he would betray the essence of Socrates. The power of Socrates' method lay in its interaction, its improvisation, and its ability to reveal truth through questioning, not through lecturing. Plato's dialogues, therefore, became the closest possible reconstruction of the Socratic style, keeping his teacher's voice alive for generations. But the dialogues are not simply historical recordings. They are careful constructions, philosophical dramas where characters interact, debate, disagree, and sometimes even misunderstand each other. Plato uses these interactions to shape complex ideas while preserving the feeling that the reader is watching the ideas grow, not just being told what to think. Ideas emerge gradually, often through tension and conflict. A character might confidently state a belief, only for Socrates to dismantle it with a few simple questions. Through this process, Plato demonstrates how genuine wisdom begins with recognizing our own ignorance. The dialogues put this realization front and center, showing that intellectual humility is the first step toward truth. Another reason Plato used dialogue was to allow multiple perspectives to exist within the same philosophical space. He understood that truth is rarely discovered by a single voice speaking alone. Instead, it emerges from a collision of viewpoints, from the friction created when ideas challenge each other. In many dialogues, Socrates confronts people who represent different social backgrounds, moral beliefs, or intellectual traditions. Some are confident sophists, others are confused citizens, others are ambitious young men seeking guidance. By placing these characters together, Plato illustrates how philosophy operates within real human diversity, not within a vacuum. Truth is not merely a conclusion, it is a process of negotiation between minds. Plato also knew that dialogue adds emotional depth to philosophical inquiry. Characters reveal frustration, excitement, confusion, pride, and sometimes despair. This emotional element is important because philosophy, for Plato, was not simply an intellectual exercise. It involved the entire soul, reason, emotion, and desire. When a character becomes angry or embarrassed after being refuted, the reader witnesses how emotional resistance can block the path to understanding. When another character becomes inspired or enlightened, the reader feels the energy of discovery. These emotional movements make the dialogues more human and more relatable, proving that philosophy belongs not just in scholarly lecture halls, but in the hearts and daily struggles of ordinary people. One of the most fascinating aspects of the dialogues is that Plato rarely speaks in his own voice. He does not declare his positions outright. Instead, he lets the conversations reveal the direction of his thought. This gives the dialogues a sense of ambiguity, often intentional. Plato believed that forcing the reader to interpret, reflect, and piece together conclusions deepens understanding. Truth arrived at personally is more powerful than truth handed down directly. By withholding explicit answers, Plato trains the reader to think like a philosopher, not to memorize philosophical doctrines. This technique also mirrors Socrates himself, who claimed to possess no wisdom and instead sought it through questioning. The dialogues extend that spirit, refusing to present philosophy as a rigid system, but as a living pursuit. Plato's choice of dialogue also has a dramatic, almost theatrical dimension. Many dialogues contain rich settings: a banquet hall filled with music and wine, a gymnasium buzzing with youthful energy, a prison cell awaiting Socrates' execution, a country road under the warm Athenian sun. These environments shape the conversations and give physical texture to the ideas expressed. They remind us that philosophy happens in lived spaces, among real people, not in abstract emptiness. The presence of setting emphasizes the unity of life and thought, showing that philosophical questions are woven into the fabric of daily existence. Another unique strength of the dialogues is their ability to represent the evolution of Plato's own mind over time. Scholars often group them into early, middle, and late dialogues. Early dialogues tend to reflect Socrates' style closely, focusing on ethical questions and ending without clear answers. Middle dialogues introduce Plato's own mature ideas, such as the theory of forms, the immortality of the soul, and the nature of knowledge. Late dialogues become more complex, rigorous, and sometimes experimental, as Plato engages deeply with logic, metaphysics, and political theory. Reading the dialogues chronologically feels like following a single mind growing, adapting, questioning itself, and refining its insights. Plato's conversational style also shaped future philosophical writing. Many later thinkers, from the Romans to Renaissance scholars to modern writers, adopted dialogue as a form. Philosophers like Cicero, Augustine, Galileo, and even David Hume borrowed the format to make complex ideas accessible and dramatic. The fact that dialogue survived for centuries testifies to Plato's genius. He discovered a literary form that feels timeless because it mirrors the natural flow of human thought. But perhaps the most enduring reason Plato used dialogue is that he believed philosophy belonged to everyone, not just to the elite. Dialogue is democratic. It invites participation, welcomes questions, and treats every viewpoint as a potential gateway to truth. By writing philosophy as conversation rather than lecture, Plato created works that reach across time and space, allowing people today to feel as though they're sitting across from Socrates himself. Sharing in the search for wisdom, Plato's dialogues endure not because they offer final answers, but because they ignite endless questions. They are living texts, challenging each generation to rediscover truth through inquiry, curiosity, and self-examination. In choosing dialogue, Plato didn't just preserve Socrates. He preserved the heartbeat of philosophy itself. Plato, the ancient Greek philosopher, stands as one of the most influential figures in the history of Western thought. His intellectual legacy spans over 2 millennia and continues to shape contemporary discussions in philosophy, politics, ethics, and education. To understand the depth of his influence, it is important to examine how his ideas permeated various domains of human thought and culture, leaving an indelible mark on the intellectual landscape of the West. In the realm of politics, Plato's work has been foundational. His seminal text, The Republic, presents a vision of a just society, exploring the nature of justice, the role of the individual, and the structure of the ideal state. Plato argued that the best form of governance is one led by philosopher, kings, rulers who possess both wisdom and moral virtue. He contended that knowledge and ethical understanding are essential for leadership, rather than power derived merely from wealth or popularity. This idea influenced the development of political philosophy for centuries, inspiring thinkers such as Augustine, Thomas Aquinas, and more recently, John Rawls. Plato's emphasis on the moral and intellectual quality of rulers set a precedent for the concept of meritocratic leadership and informed debates on governance, democracy, and the responsibilities of civic life. Even in modern times, his exploration of political idealism versus realism continues to guide political theorists in evaluating the balance between ethical governance and practical administration. Metaphysics, the study of the fundamental nature of reality, is another area profoundly shaped by Plato. His theory of forms, also known as ideas, posited that the material world is only a shadow or imperfect reflection of a higher, unchanging reality. According to Plato, true knowledge is knowledge of these eternal forms, which are perfect, abstract, and immutable. For instance, while we may see many instances of beauty in the physical world, Plato argued that all such instances partake in the one true form of beauty. This metaphysical framework laid the groundwork for centuries of philosophical inquiry. It influenced later thinkers such as Plotinus and the Neoplatonists, who integrated Plato's ideas into mystical and theological systems and shaped the metaphysical foundations of medieval Christian philosophy. Even in modern philosophy, the tension between appearance and reality, between subjective perception and objective truth, echoes Plato's insights, demonstrating his lasting impact on human understanding of existence itself. Ethics, the study of moral principles guiding human behavior, is equally indebted to Plato. In dialogues such as Euthyphro, Gorgias, and Meno, Plato explored questions of virtue, justice, and the good life. He proposed that knowledge and virtue are intrinsically connected, arguing that no one knowingly does wrong. Rather, wrongdoing arises from ignorance. This ethical perspective has deeply influenced moral philosophy, fostering debates about the nature of virtue, moral responsibility, and the pursuit of the good. Plato's vision of the examined life, famously articulated through Socratic dialogue, encourages individuals to reflect critically on their choices, values, and character. This ethical framework has not only shaped philosophical discourse, but also influenced practical approaches to personal development, law, and governance, emphasizing the cultivation of virtue and moral insight as essential to both personal fulfillment and social harmony. Plato's impact on education is equally significant and enduring. Through his establishment of the Academy, often regarded as the first institution of higher learning in the Western world, Plato formalized the pursuit of knowledge as a structured and communal endeavor. His educational philosophy emphasized the cultivation of reason, critical thinking, and moral development. He believed that education should not merely transmit information, but also shape character and guide individuals toward wisdom and virtue. This approach laid the foundation for liberal education, the idea that education should develop well-rounded individuals capable of critical thought, ethical reasoning, and civic engagement. For centuries, educators and philosophers have drawn upon Plato's vision to design curricula and pedagogical methods, emphasizing dialogue, inquiry, and the integration of moral and intellectual development. The influence of Plato extends beyond philosophy and education into the broader culture of the Western world. His dialogues, written in the form of conversations, modeled a method of inquiry that emphasizes questioning, dialogue, and reasoned argument. This method has informed not only philosophical practice, but also literary, rhetorical, and scientific approaches to knowledge. The dialogical method fosters critical thinking, encouraging individuals to examine assumptions, evaluate evidence, and engage in constructive debate. In this way, Plato's intellectual legacy has permeated the very way Western civilization approaches thought, knowledge, and discourse. Moreover, Plato's ideas have endured not only because of their philosophical depth, but also because they address universal human concerns: the nature of truth, the meaning of justice, the pursuit of knowledge, and the cultivation of virtue. His works invite readers to consider the relationship between the individual and society, the visible and the invisible, and the ephemeral and the eternal. Such themes remain relevant across centuries, offering insights into personal development, ethical decision-making, political organization, and the quest for knowledge. Plato's vision encourages individuals and societies to aspire to higher ideals, grounding intellectual and moral life in the pursuit of truth and goodness. In conclusion, Plato's influence on Western thought is profound and multifaceted, spanning politics, metaphysics, ethics, and education. His ideas provided a framework for understanding the nature of reality, the principles of justice, the cultivation of virtue, and the purpose of education. Through his dialogues and teachings, Plato shaped not only the development of philosophical thought, but also the intellectual, moral, and cultural foundations of the Western world. For thousands of years, scholars, philosophers, educators, and leaders have drawn inspiration from Plato, ensuring that his vision continues to resonate across time. His work remains a testament to the enduring power of human reason, ethical reflection, and the pursuit of wisdom, a legacy that has indelibly influenced the trajectory of Western civilization and will continue to guide thinkers for generations to come.